They gave us 3 minutes to lose with dignity. That is what the schedule said. I read it myself because reading the schedule was my work, and I had read it the way you read the weather on a day you already know is ruined. Petition 411, filed by the human delegation. Allotted time 3 minutes. Recommended disposition, dismissal. The clerk who drafted it had not even bothered to vary the wording from the last 40 petitions like it. Dismissal, 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 going down the page like raindrops down a pane. I want to tell you about the man who stood up in those 3 minutes. But first you have to understand the room, because the room is most of the story. And the man only makes sense if you can feel how small he was inside it. I am a recorder. My people are called the Veth, though that word means little to you, and the part of us that matters here is the part bred for this exact task, to sit in the high gallery of the conquered and write down what is said exactly without opinion. We do not vote. We do not speak. We are not even supposed to feel, and for most of my service I had managed that well enough. 300 sessions, 300 sets of marks. I had recorded the dissolution of a moon, the partition of a sea, the quiet selling of an entire migratory people into labor contracts, and I had not felt anything I could not file away by the end of the rest cycle. So understand that what happened to me that day surprised no one more than it surprised me. The chamber is called the tessellate. It is built the way old things are built when the builders want you to feel the weight of every year that came before you. A bowl of black stone, wide enough that a person standing at the bottom looks like a dropped coin. Above the floor, ring upon ring of seats climbing into shadow, one ring for every settled people of standing, arranged by age of admission. The oldest sit lowest, closest to the floor, where their voices carry without effort. The newest sit highest, near the cold near us, the recorders, where you have to almost shout to be heard, and where the air tastes faintly of the machines that keep the place breathing. Humanity sat at the very top. Of course they did. They had been admitted to the conquered 40 of their years ago, which in the arithmetic of that chamber is nothing, is barely the time it takes for the lowest rings to finish a thought. Up there with them sat the other recent peoples, the ones still learning which silences were dangerous, and I had a clear view of the human delegation because I sat just above and behind them, close enough to hear the small sounds they made that the floor would never catch. There were 4 of them that day. I had seen humans before, you understand. They are not strange to look at once you stop expecting them to be strange. Soft creatures, warm-blooded with faces that move constantly, that leak their insides all over the surface so that you can read fear and hope and exhaustion right there on the skin. Most peoples of standing have learned to still their faces. Humans never bothered. It made them seem, to the lower rings, like children who had wandered into a war council. 3 of the 4 were what you would expect. A senior delegate in formal dress, gray at the temples, the kind of person who has spent a career losing votes politely. An aide beside her, very young, holding a slate and looking like he might be sick. A legal officer older, with the flat, dead calm of someone who has already accepted the outcome and is only here to make sure the loss is recorded correctly. And then there was the 4th one. He did not belong with them. You could see it. He was not dressed for the chamber. The others wore the dark fitted clothes of delegation, and he wore something that looked like it had been made for outdoor work, faded at the seams, a jacket the color of wet sand with a worn patch on one elbow. He was not young and not old. His hands were rough. He kept them folded in his lap, and he kept his eyes down, not in submission, but in the way of a person listening to something the rest of the room could not hear. He did not fidget. The young aide fidgeted enough for all of them. This man sat as still as stone, and the stillness of him was the first thing in 300 sessions that made me actually look up from my marks. His name, I would learn, was Daniel Reyes. He was not a politician. He was not a lawyer. He was, by trade, a person who listens to oceans. I did not know yet that this was the most dangerous kind of person to put in that room. Let me tell you what the petition was about, because the petition is where the cruelty lived, and the cruelty was completely legal. There is a world In the Concord's catalog, it has no name, only a string, subpelagic body 9 Theta 4. A water world almost entirely ocean, a single skin of black sea wrapped around a heavy stone heart. The humans had surveyed it. They were the ones who found it, in the way new peoples are always sent to find things, doing the tedious, careful work the old peoples consider beneath them. Humanity called the world Surrey. I never learned why. It was the kind of name you give a thing when you are alone with it for a long time, and you stop being able to think of it as a number. Beneath Surrey Sea lived something. Now here you must be careful because the language matters, and the language is the whole trap. The Concord recognizes standing. Standing is the thing that makes a people in the eyes of the law, the thing that means you cannot be mined or dissolved or sold. To have standing, you must have a recognized voice, a representative, someone who can come to this chamber or send their words to it and say, "We are here, we object." No voice, no standing. No standing, and you are not a people. You are biomass. You are terrain. You are a resource on a survey sheet, and resources can be claimed. The thing beneath Surrey Sea had no voice the Concord could recognize. So in the catalog it was listed under a single word, and the word was inert. Class inert biomass. That was the official finding. Not alive in any way that counted, not a people. Not even an animal worth the protections we give to clever animals. Inert. The presiding survey, conducted by an old and respected people whose designation I will give you as the Stratton, had passed instruments over the sea for the standard observation period, 11 days, and recorded nothing they were willing to call a voice. Some low vibration in the crust. Some movement. Geology, they wrote. Tectonics inert. And the Stratton wanted the world. That is the part you must hold on to. The same people who had certified Surrey as empty of voices were the people petitioning to dissolve it. They had a process for water worlds. You crack the stone heart, you let the heat boil the sea off into harvestable vapor, you strip the metals out of the exposed rock, and in something like 200 years you have a dead, efficient little quarry that pays for itself many times over. They had done it to 40 worlds. They were very good at it. There was nothing wrong with it, under the law, because the law said the world was empty, because the survey said the world was empty, because the world had no voice. Humanity's petition asked the Concord to stop it. That was all. They were not claiming Surrey for themselves. They had no basis to. You cannot own a world just because you walked across it first. They were not asking for resources or trade rights or anything the chamber understood how to want. They were asking the Concord to look again, to grant Surrey Sea a stay of dissolution and reopen the question of standing, to consider that the thing in the water might be someone. It was, in the cold arithmetic of that room, the stupidest petition I had recorded in years. You have to understand why. A people of standing for 2,000 years, the Stratton, with allies and debts and old favors threaded through every lower ring, against a people of standing for 40 years who had no allies and no favors and nothing to offer anyone. And the thing they were fighting for could not even appear, could not testify, could not, by the only definition the chamber accepted, speak. Every precedent ran one direction. Every instrument said the same thing. The young clerk had written dismissal on the schedule because dismissal was not a prediction. It was a fact that had not finished happening yet. The session opened the way it always opens, with the striking of the clock. I should tell you about the clock, because the clock matters more than you would think. In the center of the tessellate floor stands a column of dark metal, taller than 3 humans, and inside it a mechanism that has kept the Concord's time for longer than most peoples in the room have existed. At the open of each session it strikes once. A single deep tone that you feel in the floor before you hear it in the air, and then it begins to tick, slow, a beat every 2 seconds more or less, steady as a heart. It is meant to remind everyone that time is being spent, that the chamber is expensive, that you should say your piece and sit down. It runs the whole session. Tick, tick, tick. You stop hearing it after a while, the way you stop hearing your own pulse. Remember the clock, it comes back. The Stratton spoke first, because age speaks first. Their lead advocate rose from one of the lowest rings, An enormous careful person, all smooth gray plates and slow gestures, and addressed the chamber in the unhurried voice of someone who has never once doubted the outcome of anything. I recorded every word. I will not give them all to you, because they were the words you would expect, and they were beautiful in the way a well-made trap is beautiful. They did not sneer at the humans. That was the craft of it. They praised them. They called the human survey of Surrey thorough and commendable. They said the human concern did them credit, that compassion was a fine quality in a young people, that the conquered was richer for having voices that still trembled at the thought of a sea boiled away. And then, gently, the way you take a tool from a child who might hurt themselves with it, they explained why compassion was not law. The findings were certified, they said. 11 days of observation, the standard period, by instruments more sensitive than any the human survey had carried. No voice, no standing. They were sorry, but the sea was inert, and a sea that is inert is a resource, and the conquered had built 2,000 years of peace on the simple rule that resources belong to those who can use them. To grant a stay now on feeling against the findings would be to unmake that rule. Today it is one water world. Tomorrow every quarry, every harvest, every contract is open to challenge by any young people with a soft heart and a survey sheet. The Stratine were not asking the conquered to be cruel. They were asking it to be consistent. And consistency in that room was the highest virtue there was. It was a very good argument. I watched the lower rings move with it, the small shiftings and settlings that mean a chamber has made up its mind. They were not even angry at the humans. They simply agreed with the Stratine, the way you agree that water is wet. When the Stratine advocate sat down, the presiding officer turned to the high rings and spoke the words that were on the schedule. The human delegation has 3 minutes. Tick, tick, tick. I watched the senior human delegate, the gray-templed one, get to her feet. And here is the thing I have thought about more than almost anything since. She was good. In her 3 minutes, she did everything right. She was calm. She was precise. She did not weep or beg. She made the legal point that the standard observation period had been designed for fast worlds, for peoples who lived and signaled at speeds the instruments were built to catch, and that Surrey might simply be slower than the law's imagination. She asked reasonably for more time. She used her 3 minutes exactly, not a beat over, and she sat down with the dignity of a person who knows she has just lost and intends to lose well. It changed nothing. I could see it changing nothing. The lower rings had not even shifted. The presiding officer was already reaching for the procedure that would close the petition. The young clerk's word was about to finish happening. And then the fourth human stood up. He had not been scheduled to speak. The 3 minutes were spent. There was a low sound in the lower rings, the dry rustle of 2,000 years of protocol being offended all at once, and the presiding officer made the gesture that means sit down, you have no time. Daniel Reyes did not sit down. He did not raise his voice either. That was the strange part. A person who interrupts the conquered usually does it loudly, desperately, the way the doomed get loud. He just stood there in his sand-colored jacket, with his rough, folded hands now open at his sides, and he waited for the rustle to die. And when it had mostly died, he said something I had never heard anyone say in that chamber in 300 sessions. I'm not here to argue with you, he said. I think you're right about the law. I've read it. You're right. He let that sit. The lower rings did not know what to do with it. You cannot win an argument against someone who has already conceded it. I just want to play you something. It's 40 seconds. Then I'll sit down and you can vote however you want. 40 seconds. The presiding officer hesitated, and the hesitation was its own small miracle, and I think it happened only because the request was so strange and so small that refusing it would have looked stranger than allowing it. 40 seconds against 2,000 years. What was 40 seconds? The officer made the gesture that means proceed. The young aide, hands shaking, did something to his slate, and the chamber's sound system, built to carry the measured speeches of careful old peoples, filled the great black bowl of the tessellate with the sound of Surrey's sea. I should tell you what it sounded like. But I have tried to write this part many times and I keep failing because there are no marks in my recorder's craft for what came out of those speakers. It was low. Lower than a voice should go, low enough that I felt it in the floor before my ears made sense of it, the way you feel the clock strike. It rose and fell. It had shape. It folded back on itself and came again, changed, the way a thing comes again when it is answering itself. It was not geology. I have recorded geology. Geology does not wait its turn. And under it, woven through it, was a second sound. And the second sound was the thing that stopped my hands on the page. But that is where the 40 seconds end, and where everything I thought I understood about that room began to come apart, and I find I cannot tell it all in one breath. Let me gather myself. Let me tell you the rest properly, because the rest is the part that matters, and I will not rush it the way the chamber tried to rush him. What I will tell you now before I go on is this. I had sat in that gallery for 300 sessions and recorded the deaths of worlds with steady hands. I was bred for steady hands. And on the day Daniel Reyes played 40 seconds of a C, the conquered had certified as silent. I, who am not supposed to feel, set down my stylus and found that I could not pick it up again. The clock kept ticking, tick, 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 as if nothing in the universe had changed. It had, everything had. I just did not have the marks to write it down yet. The 40 seconds ended. I want you to understand how strange the silence was after. The tessellate is never truly silent. Even when no one speaks, there is the hum of the air machines, the small shiftings of 2,000 years of bodies, the tick of the great clock. But when that sound from Surrey's sea stopped, the chamber went into a hush so complete that I could hear the young human aide breathing, 3 rings below me, fast and shallow, like a small animal that has just run a long way. Daniel Reyes sat down. He had promised 40 seconds and he had taken 40 seconds and not one beat more. He folded his rough hands back into his lap and he looked at the floor again, the way he had looked at it before, listening to something the rest of us could not hear. He did not look like a man who had just done anything at all. That was the most unnerving part. He looked like a man waiting for a tide. For a moment, nothing. And then the lower rings began to recover, and the recovery was an ugly thing to watch, because I had seen it before and I knew what it meant. It meant the chamber had been moved, and the chamber did not like being moved, and now it would work very hard to unmove itself. A people that has held power for 2,000 years does not stay powerful by letting 40 seconds change its mind. It stays powerful by knowing exactly how to make 40 seconds mean nothing. The Stratine advocate rose again, slower this time. I noticed the slowness. The first time they had risen with the ease of someone certain. Now there was a care in it, a deliberateness, the way you move when you have felt the floor shift under you and you are pretending you have not. They did not raise their voice. They never did. That was the whole horror of them. A remarkable recording, they said, truly. The young delegation has a gift for the dramatic, and I mean that as praise. There is no people in this chamber whose heart did not stir at that sound. A pause perfectly measured. But this chamber does not run on stirred hearts. It runs on findings. And so I must ask the question that the recording so beautifully distracts us from. What precisely did we just hear? They let it hang. I will tell you what the instruments would say, they went on. Hydrothermal venting across a fractured seabed produces sound. Pressure differentials in a deep ocean produce sound. The slow grinding of tectonic plates produces sound, and on a heavy world like this one with a stone heart that large, it produces a great deal of it. Low, rhythmic, folding back on itself, as the honored recorder above us no doubt noted. They did not look up at me, but I felt the words land on me anyway, and I felt my stilled hands go cold. We are a people who have boiled away 40 seas. We know the sound a sea makes. We have heard worlds sing before. They are not singing. They are settling. The young delegation has heard a voice in the wind because they wanted to hear one. It is the oldest mistake there is and the most forgivable, and it is still a mistake. The lower rings moved with that. I felt them resettle, felt the chamber begin to pour itself back into the shape the Stratine had built. Of course, Tectonics. Venting. We had let a clever recording frighten us for 40 seconds, and now a calm old voice had explained the trick, and we could go back to being consistent. I watched the senior human delegate's face fall just slightly, just at the corners, and I understood that she had known this would happen. She had let Daniel have his 40 seconds because she had nothing left to lose, and now she was watching the 40 seconds be explained away. And she was already composing in her mind the dignified silence with which she would accept the vote. And then Daniel Ray stood up again. This time the rustle of offended protocol was louder, and this time the presiding officer's gesture to sit was sharper, and this time Daniel did the most reckless thing I had seen anyone do in that chamber. He spoke over it. "You're right," he said again. "That's the thing, you keep being right and it keeps not mattering." His voice was not loud, but it had something underneath it now, something I had not heard in the first 40 seconds, a kind of tiredness that was older than anger. Venting makes sound. Grinding makes sound. I know. I spent 2 years listening to all of it. You want to know how I know it wasn't venting? He looked up, and for the first time he looked directly at the Stratton advocate, across the whole black bowl of the chamber. A soft, warm creature in a worn jacket staring down 2,000 years. Because venting doesn't stop to listen. And that sound stopped to listen. Give me 4 minutes and I'll prove it. 4 minutes. He had said 40 seconds before and kept his word exactly. And now he was asking for 4 minutes. And the asking of it after the keeping of the first promise did something to the chamber that I do not think Daniel planned, though I have wondered. The presiding officer hesitated again. And in the hesitation, the senior human delegate stood and said quietly that her delegation yielded the remainder of any time it might be owed, all of it, every future minute it could ever claim, to this man right now. It was not a thing the rules clearly allowed. It was not clearly a thing the rules forbade. The legal officer, the flat, calm one, was already on his feet reciting the procedural basis for it, fast and dense. The way you build a bridge while you are already walking across it. The presiding officer looked at the Stratton. The Stratton, who could not object to a delegation spending its own time without looking afraid of what that time might contain, made the small gesture that means let them. 4 minutes. Daniel did not play another recording. That surprised everyone, I think, including the Stratton, who had braced for more drama and got none. Instead, he started to talk, and what he talked about was not law and not the chamber and not the Stratton. He talked about how he came to be standing there at all, and I am going to give you this part as close to whole as I can, because it is the part that broke the room, and it broke the room precisely because it was so small. He had not wanted the Surrey assignment. He said that plainly, the way you admit something that no longer costs you anything. He was a listener by trade, what the humans call a hydrophone technician, a person who drops instruments into water and writes down what the water says. It is not glamorous work. On the survey ship, he was the one nobody needed in a hurry. The geologists had the stone, the chemists had the sea, the cartographers had the surface, and Daniel had the sound, which everyone agreed was the least important data they would collect, because everyone already knew what the sound of an empty ocean was. Background, hiss and groan, nothing. The 11-day observation period the law required, the Stratton had completed in 11 days, and they had been thorough, and they had found nothing, because 11 days is 11 days. But the human survey was not bound by the Stratton's clock. They were young people doing tedious work, and tedious work is slow, and they were at Surrey for 2 years of their reckoning, mapping a world nobody important cared about, and for 2 years Daniel's instrument sat in the black water and listened. He almost did not notice it. He said that too. For most of the first year he heard exactly what he expected to hear, the hiss and the groan, the empty ocean, and he ran his array on a long automatic cycle and spent his attention on the things that seemed to matter more. He was, he said, going through something in that first year. He did not say what. He said it the way humans say a thing they have decided not to explain, and the not explaining told you it was grief of some kind, the ordinary kind. the kind that has nothing to do with surveys or worlds. And I will tell you that hearing a man mention his own private sorrow in the tessellate, where peoples come to discuss the deaths of worlds without ever once mentioning their own small deaths, was so strange that even the lower rings went still for it. What he said was this, that sometimes when a person is carrying something heavy, they get very good at sitting with a thing for a long time, that his attention in that first bad year had nowhere it wanted to be, and so it went into the water, into the long automatic cycle of sound that no one else would ever listen to all the way through. And somewhere in the second year, sitting with the hiss and the groan the way you sit with grief, he noticed that the groan was not random. It came in patterns that took days to complete, not minutes, not hours, days. A phrase, if you could call it that, might begin on one day and resolve on the next, so slowly that no instrument tuned to catch a fast world's quick signals would ever string the pieces together. The Stratton's instruments had not missed the sound. They had recorded all of it. They had simply sampled it the way you would sample any sound, in slices, in the assumption that anything meaningful would happen at the speed meaningful things happen at, the speed of fast, warm peoples with quick hearts. They cut the song into pieces too short to hold a phrase, looked at each piece, found noise in each piece, and certified the whole as noise. It was, Daniel said, like trying to read a sentence by looking at one letter a day, and concluding that writing did not exist. You measured it for 11 days, he said, with instruments built by people who live fast and think fast and need their answers fast. And you found nothing, and you were honest about finding nothing, and I believe you. But you were looking for a voice that talks at your speed, and they don't talk at your speed. They talk at the speed of a thing that lives in cold, heavy water under enormous pressure and is in no hurry at all. To them, our whole survey, 2 years of it, was maybe one long afternoon. The 11 days you watched them, he paused. You watched them for about as long as it takes one of them to take a breath. I stopped recording again. I want to be honest with you about that. A recorder is bred for steadiness, and I had broken my own steadiness twice now in a single session, and the second time was worse than the first, because the first time I had felt only awe, and the second time I felt something closer to shame. I had sat in that gallery for 300 sessions and recorded 40 worlds certified empty, and I had never once asked whether empty meant empty or only meant too slow for us to bother hearing. The marks I had made, 300 sessions of perfect marks, suddenly felt like a different kind of record than I had thought I was keeping. The Stratton advocate did not sit quietly through this. They could not. They interrupted, and the interruption was sharper than anything they had said yet, the first crack in the smooth, gray calm, and that crack told me more than any of their words had. They said this was poetry, not proof. They said a clever young person could find a pattern in anything if he stared at noise long enough and wanted a pattern badly enough. That this was the oldest failure of perception there was, the mind making faces in the dark. They said the human's own grief, which he had so movingly confessed, was exactly the thing that should make the chamber distrust his ears. A man in pain hears voices in the water. That is not a finding. That is a symptom. It was cruel, and it was clever, and it was. The lower rings clearly felt, probably true. And Daniel, instead of getting angry, did a thing I will remember as long as I keep any memory at all. He agreed with them. Again. You're right that I wanted it to mean something, he said quietly. You're right that I was in a bad way and I needed something out there to be alive. I'm not going to pretend I'm a clean instrument. I'm not. I'm a person who was sad and lonely on a survey ship and heard something in the dark and wanted it to be real. He let that confession sit in the open where everyone could see it, undefended, and somehow making himself smaller made the next thing larger. So I didn't trust myself. That's the whole point. I knew I couldn't trust myself. So I did the only thing you can do when you can't trust your own ears. I stopped listening for what I wanted, and I started listening for whether the water was listening back. He explained it simply, and the simplicity was the blade. A pattern that you imagine, he said, does not change when you change, but a voice that is answering you does. So he ran a test that any frightened, doubting person could run that needed no special instruments, only patience. He started making sound back. Not words. He had no words they could understand. Just sound, regular, deliberate, dropped into the water on a schedule, and then he waited, the way you wait for a slow thing, and he listened to see whether the song changed. It changed. Not at his speed. He had to wait days. But over the back half of the second year, the song beneath Surrey's sea began slowly to fold his sounds into itself, to repeat them back altered, to leave gaps where his sounds would go, as if holding a place open, and then to fill those gaps when he filled them, and to wait when he waited. The thing in the water had noticed that something new in its ocean was making deliberate sound. And it had started in the only way it knew how, in the only speed it had to answer. Venting doesn't do that, Daniel said. Grinding doesn't do that. Tectonics has never once in the history of anything held a space open and waited for someone to fill it. That's not what rock does. That's what people do. It's the first thing people do. Before language, before anything, the first thing is one of you makes a sound and waits to see if the other one answers. He looked around the rings, the high cold ones where his own people sat and the low warm ones where the old people sat, the whole 2,000-year stack of standing. Every single one of us in this room exists because somewhere back at the start, somebody made a sound into the dark and somebody answered. That's all standing is. That's all a voice ever was. And there's a sea full of them down there doing it right now, and we certified them inert because they're too slow to do it on our schedule. The 4 minutes were long gone. No one had stopped him. The presiding officer had not made the gesture to sit, and the Stratine had not interrupted again, and the great clock in the center of the floor kept ticking, tick, 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 2 seconds to a beat. And I became aware of it the way you become aware of a thing that has suddenly turned into an insult. That clock. That impatient, certain, 2,000-year clock, measuring out the chamber's precious spent time in beats faster than the heart of anything that lived under Surrey's sea could even register. We had built our whole idea of voice around the speed of that clock. We had decided that to be real you had to be quick. I looked at the Stratine advocate and I saw something I had never seen on that smooth gray face. I saw calculation turn into fear. Not fear of the humans were nothing. Fear of the precedent. Because if the chamber accepted even once that a voice could be too slow to hear and still be a voice, then 40 boiled seas became 40 open questions, and every quarry the Stratine had ever cut became a grave they might have to answer for. And the whole consistent 2,000-year edifice of use, what cannot object developed, very quietly, a crack you could put your hand into. They moved to dismiss. Fast. The fear made them fast. They argued procedure, that the human's account, however moving, was testimony without evidence, an anecdote about sounds in water with no instrument the chamber could verify, and that the chamber could not overturn a certified survey on the strength of one grieving man's memory of an afternoon in the dark. They demanded, with the confidence of people who believe they are asking for the impossible, that if the human truly claimed the sea answered, he produced the proof here now, in this chamber, in a form the conquered could verify with its own instruments. Otherwise dismiss, and let the schedule finish what it had started. And Daniel Reyes, who had agreed with them at every turn, who had conceded the law and conceded his own unreliable heart and conceded everything they threw at him, finally did not agree. "I can prove it," he said. "I brought everything. 2 years of recordings, the call and answer logs, the whole thing. You can run it through your own instruments, I want you to, but it won't fit in 4 minutes and it won't fit in 40 because the proof is the slowness. The proof is that you have to wait for the answer. You can't verify a slow voice with a fast look. You already tried that. That's how we got here." He stood there, this small, soft, tired man, and he asked the tessellate for the one thing the tessellate had never given anything in 2,000 years. The one thing that clock was built to deny. He asked us to wait. "Give them the time," he said. "Not me, them. Let the chamber sit and listen to the sea on the sea's own clock, long enough for it to answer, and if it doesn't answer, dismiss me, dissolve the world, I'll never say another word. But if you won't even wait, then don't tell yourselves the sea is silent. Tell the truth. Say the sea might be speaking and we have decided we are too busy to find out. The presiding officer did not reach for the procedure to close the petition. That, more than anything, was the moment the day turned. Not the recording, not the speech. The simple fact that the officer's hand, which had been moving toward dismissal for the last hour, stopped, and stayed stopped, and the great clock ticked into a silence that no one in the lower rings rushed to fill. I had recorded 300 sessions. I had never once seen the chamber consider waiting for anything. And I will tell you the truth, because I am a recorder, and the truth is the only thing I am for. In that silence, with my stilled hands and my abandoned stylus, I was no longer hopping the petition would lose with dignity. I was a being who is not supposed to hope at all, sitting in the high cold rings, and I was praying to nothing in particular that this room I had served for 300 sessions would, just once, for the slowest and most voiceless thing any of us had ever refused to hear, agree to be still. The clock ticked, tick, tick, tick. And the presiding officer turned slowly toward the lowest rings, where the oldest people sat, to ask them a question the conquered had no procedure for. What happened in that silence, and what the sea finally said when we did at last sit down to listen on its own clock, and what it cost the Stratine, and what it cost Daniel Reyes, and the one thing in that recording that I have still not told you about, the second sound. The one woven under the song that made me set down my stylus, and that I have been circling this whole time because I am almost afraid to write it down even now. All of that is still to come. But the silence had begun. The clock kept its impatient time, the way it always had, the way it always would. And for the first time in 2,000 years, nobody in the chamber was listening to it. The presiding officer turned to the oldest rings and asked them a question the conquered had no words for. So the officer had to build the words on the spot, and you could hear them being built, slow and careful, like a person crossing a river by feeling for stones. The question was this: did the chamber wish to grant a period of direct observation, not the standard 11 days, a period long enough by the human's own account for a thing that breathes once in 11 days to be given a chance to answer? The officer did not say how long that would be because no one knew. Because no one had ever asked to see how long it took to think. I sat in the high cold rings with my abandoned stylus and I watched the oldest peoples consider it, and I will tell you that the considering was the most frightened I had ever seen them. Not frightened of the sea, frightened of the question, because the question, once asked aloud in the tessellate, could not be unasked. If the chamber granted the time and the sea did not answer, the Stratine would have their world and the precedent would die clean. But if the chamber refused even to grant the time, then it would have refused on the record, in front of 2,000 years of its own dignity, to spend a few days finding out whether it was about to kill someone. And the oldest peoples were old precisely, because they had always understood that what a chamber refuses to find out, it can be made to answer for later. The Stratine fought it. Of course they fought it. But the way they fought it told me everything, because they did not fight it on the law anymore. They fought it on the clock. Time, the Stratine advocate said, is the chamber's only real wealth. Every day the tessellate sits is a day 1,000 worlds wait on its decisions. To halt the business of the conquered to stare at an ocean, on the word of one grieving surveyor, was not caution. It was indulgence. It was the young delegation asking the entire settled galaxy to hold its breath while a man finished mourning into the water. And where would it end? Grant this, and every petitioner with a sad story and a recording would demand the chamber sit and wait. The dignity of the conquered, they said, rested on the principle that it did not wait, that it decided, that it moved. It was, I realized, the clock defending itself. 2,000 years of that steady, impatient tick had become a kind of belief, and the belief was that to be powerful was to be fast, and to be fast was to be right, and anything too slow to keep up with the chamber's heartbeat did not deserve to be heard by it. The Stratine were not defending a survey. They were defending the clock, and the clock had never lost. Daniel Reyes did not argue back. He had said his piece and he had no more time to spend, and he knew it, and he sat with his rough hands open and let the old peoples decide. But the senior human delegate rose one last time, the gray-templed one, and she spent the very last of whatever standing her people had on a single sentence, and the sentence was not a legal argument and it was not a plea. It was a trade. She offered Surrey, not the sea. The humans had no claim to the sea and they knew it. She offered the only thing of value her young people possessed, which was the survey itself. 2 years of human labor mapping a world the old peoples had not bothered to map carefully. All of it, every chart and core sample and mineral assay. The complete catalog of everything that made Surrey worth dissolving, signed over to the Concord's open archive. Free, for anyone, the moment the chamber agreed to listen. If the sea proved silent, the Stratine would lose nothing. They would have their world and now also a perfect map of it, a gift. If the sea answered, the chamber would have spent a few days and saved a people. Either way, she said, the humans paid. The only thing the chamber risked was time, and she was offering to make even the time profitable. It was a clever, desperate, humiliating offer, and it worked. And it worked because it gave the old peoples a way to grant the time without admitting they were granting it out of doubt. They could call it a trade. They could call it shrewd. They could vote to wait and tell themselves they had simply gotten a free survey out of a sentimental young people, and never once say the word that the whole chamber was thinking, which was, what if he's right? The vote to grant observation was not close. That surprised me until I understood it. It was not close because the old peoples had found a way to make caution look like profit, and once caution looks like profit, even a frightened chamber can afford it. They granted 90 days. 90 days of the Concord's own reckoning. The officer said it on the record. The Stratine advocate sat very still and very smooth and said nothing, and the stillness was worse than any objection, because I had learned to read that stillness now, and the stillness meant they were no longer trying to win the vote. They were trying to win the 90 days. I should have understood then what that meant. I did not fully, not yet. I was a recorder, not a strategist. I thought the danger had passed. I thought we were going to sit and listen, and that listening was the brave thing, and the brave thing had won. I did not yet understand that you can grant a slow thing all the time in the universe, and still find a way to use the time against it. Here is how the listening was done. The chamber did not move, but the work moved to the chamber. Over the first days, the Concord's own instruments were sent to Surrey. The real instruments, the sensitive ones, not the survey's quick samplers, but the deep listening arrays the Concord used when it actually wanted to hear a thing. The humans handed over Daniel's positions, the exact places in the black water where he had dropped his hydrophones, the schedule of calls he had made, the logs of every answer. And the Concord's arrays sank into the cold and began, for the first time in the sea's existence, to listen the way Daniel had listened. Patiently, on the sea's clock, recording everything, sampling nothing, holding the whole long song instead of cutting it into pieces. And then the chamber waited. I want you to try to imagine it, because I do not think it has happened before or since, and I was there for the whole of it. The tessellate, that great black bowl built to hold the fast certain speech of fast certain peoples, sitting in silence day after day, while a sea on the far side of the catalog took its slow breaths. The lower rings did not empty. That surprised me. I had expected them to drift away, to leave clerks to mind the listening and return for the vote. But they did not, because the Stratine did not, and no people of standing was going to be the one absent if the sea spoke. So they stayed. 2,000 years of standing, sitting in the dark, listening to nothing, waiting for an ocean. The clock kept ticking, tick, 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 and now everyone heard it. There was nothing else to hear. The great impatient clock, which the chamber had built to hurry the slow and which had never been disobeyed, ticked into the silence we had granted the sea. And every tick was the clock's voice saying, "This is a waste. This is a waste. Decide, decide, decide." And for 90 days the chamber sat and did not obey it. And I think that was the first true act of patience the Tessellate had ever performed, and it nearly tore the chamber apart. Because here is the thing about waiting which the Stratine understood and the humans had not fully reckoned with. Waiting is not neutral. Waiting has a current. Every silent day that passed without the sea saying anything a fast people could recognize, the chamber's mood turned, slow and certain as a tide going out. The first days had a hush of held breath. By the 20th day the hush had soured. The lower rings began to mutter that they had been made fools of, that the grieving surveyor had bought 90 days of the conquered silence with a sad story and a free map, and that the Stratine had been right all along, that the clock had been right all along, that the sea was settling rock, and they had let a young people stop the galaxy to listen to gravel. The Stratine said nothing to encourage this. They did not have to. They simply waited like the sea and let the chamber's impatience do their work for them. That was the trap inside the gift. The humans had won the time, but time in that chamber had only ever flowed one direction, and the longer it flowed, the more it carried everyone back toward the Stratine. Daniel Reyes came every day. He had no standing to sit on the floor, so he sat in the high rings near his own people near me, and he listened to the live feed of the arrays through a small device in his ear. And he did not look worried, and his not looking worried became, by the 40th day, its own kind of unbearable thing to watch, because by then everyone had decided he was a fool or a fraud, and his calm seemed like the calm of a man who did not understand he had already lost. I asked him once. I should not have. A recorder does not speak. But I had not made a clean mark in 40 days. My craft was already broken, and one night when the chamber had thinned to the ones who had to stay, I leaned down from my row and I asked him, very quietly in the trade speech we all share, why he was not afraid. He did not seem surprised that a recorder spoke. Humans, I have come to understand, are surprised by very little that involves another person wanting to talk. Because they're still doing it, he said. He meant the sea. I made a call 3 days ago on the old schedule just to see. They held the space open. The Concord's instruments caught it. It's in the record. They're still waiting for me to fill it. He smiled, a tired human smile. They've been waiting for me to answer for 3 days. They'll wait longer than that. They're not in a hurry. They've never been in a hurry. That's the whole thing. Nobody can stand about them. He looked down at the floor at the great ticking clock. Everybody in this room is terrified of slow. The sea isn't scared of slow. Slow is just where they live. I went back to my row. I did not record what he said. It was not said in session. But I have kept it, and I am giving it to you now, because it was the truest thing anyone said in those 90 days, and the chamber never heard it. On the 61st day, the sea answered. Not the way the chamber had imagined. The chamber, for all its impatience, had still been waiting for a voice, for the song to suddenly do something a fast people would recognize as speech, some clear, unmistakable word that would settle the matter. That is not what happened. What happened was that the Concord's listening arrays, having held the whole long song unbroken for 60 days, finally had enough of it to lay the slow phrases side by side and see the shape of the thing entire. And the shape, when the chamber's own analysts assembled it and slowed the chamber's own clock to match it, and finally played it back compressed so a fast people could take it in, was the thing I have been circling this whole time. The second sound. The one woven under the song, the one that made me set down my stylus on the first day, and that I have not been able to make myself write until now. I will write it now. Under the slow song of the sea, threaded through it, repeated across years, the singers of Surrey had been reproducing a sound that did not belong to their world. A sound from outside. A pattern of sharp percussive strikes, regular, brutal, the sound of something hard hammering the seabed at intervals, and after each cluster of strikes, a long, deep tone that fell and did not resolve. It was the sound of the Stratine's own survey. Decades before the humans ever came to Surrey, before the catalog, before the certification of asterisk inert, the Stratine had passed through that ocean once already in the early way when they were prospecting, and they had done what they always did to sound a seabed for dissolution. They had struck it. Percussive-sounding charges, hard concussive blows against the stone heart to map the rock by its echoes. The humans found the records later, in the Stratine's own archive, exactly where the dates said they would be. The Stratine had struck Surrey's seabed 40 of their years ago, and listened to the echoes and written down the metal content and moved on. And they had never once stopped to wonder what the strikes had sounded like to anything living in that water, because the survey had not yet been done that would tell them anything was living in that water, because the thing that lived in that water was too slow to register in the 11 days they bothered to watch. But the singers had registered it. They had felt the strikes, the brutal hammering of a people sounding their world for slaughter, and in the slow years after, in the only way they had, the only thing they could do, they had taken that sound, the sound of the thing that had come and struck them and left, and they had folded it into their song, over and over, the strikes and the long falling tone after. They had been singing it for 40 years. They had taught it to each other. The young ones, if there were young ones, had learned it from the old. It had become part of who they were, the way grief becomes part of who you are, the way a people who have been hurt carry the shape of the hurt in everything they make afterward. The sea was singing back the sound of the people who had certified it dead. That is what I heard on the first day, woven under the song. That is what stopped my hands. I did not understand it then. None of us did. It took the chamber 60 days of slow listening to assemble the shape of it. But some part of me, the part a recorder is not supposed to have, had heard the strikes under the song and had known, before I had any words for it, that I was listening to a memory of being struck. When the chamber's analysts played the assembled thing back, compressed in the tessellate, and laid the Stratine's own 40-year-old survey log beside it, and the two matched, strike for strike, tone for tone, so exactly that there could be no question, no talk of patterns imagined by a grieving mind, no settling rock, no venting, no clever recording, only the plain verifiable fact that a sea the Stratine had declared inert had spent 40 years singing the Stratine's own crime back at the dark. The tessellate went silent in a way that was different from all the silence that had come before. I have recorded 300 sessions, and I have no marks for that silence either. The Stratine advocate did not rise. For a long moment they did not move at all, the great smooth gray stillness, and then they did move. And what they did was the worst thing they could have done, and they did it because they were old and powerful and had never once in 2,000 years been caught, and creatures who have never been caught do not know how to be caught gracefully. They reached for the clock. The advocate rose slow and said, into the terrible silence, that the chamber must be careful not to let a coincidence of acoustics become a verdict. That sound reflects that the survey strikes of 40 years ago would naturally echo in the rock for a very long time, that the chamber was hearing not a memory but a reverberation, physics and not grief, and that to call it song was once again the young people's sentiment dressing up an echo as a soul. It was, they said, exactly the kind of slow accident a slow ocean would produce, and the chamber had spent 61 days and a great deal of its dignity, and should not now, in its embarrassment at having waited so long for so little, overcorrect into believing a rock had wept. And it might have worked. I have to tell you, it might have worked. The chamber wanted it to work. The chamber had sat in the dark for 61 days and been made to feel slow and foolish, and it desperately wanted to be told that the discomfort had been for nothing, that the sea was rock after all, that the clock had been right and they could go home. An echo, physics, not grief. The lower rings began, I felt them begin, to reach for it the way a falling person reaches for any handhold. And then Daniel Reyes stood up in the high rings, with no standing and no time and no right to speak at all, and he said 6 words that ended it. Then why, he said, did it stop? The chamber did not understand. The Stratine advocate did not understand. I did not understand, not in that first instant. An echo doesn't stop when you stop hitting it, Daniel said. It just fades, but the strikes in the song don't fade. They repeat clean for 40 years, exactly the same, like they're being remembered, not reflected. And then he gestured to the human aide who with shaking hands brought up the last piece, the piece Daniel had been holding since the first day, the piece he had never played. And then about 2 years ago, the strikes change. They get quieter. They start to fold around something new. A new sound starts answering them in the song. He let the chamber sit with it for one beat. That's when we got there. That's when I started making my calls. 40 years they sang the sound of being struck into the dark, alone. And then something new came into their ocean and started making deliberate sound at them, and they reached for it. And the song started to change. Echoes don't do that. Echoes don't get quieter the day someone finally shows up to listen. He sat down. And the tessellate, the great black bowl built to hold the fast certain speech of fast certain peoples, understood all at once, in a silence with no marks, that it was not hearing a reverberation in rock. It was hearing 40 years of grief, sung by someone into the dark, who had never once been answered, until a sad, lonely man on a survey ship dropped a sound into the water and waited. The clock ticked, tick, tick, tick. But the vote had not happened yet. The chamber understood, and understanding is not the same as deciding, and the Stratton were old and powerful and not yet finished, and there were still 90 days worth of impatience and 2,000 years of consistency standing between the sea and its standing. What the chamber would do with what it now understood, and what the Stratton did next. In the last days, when they realized they could no longer win on the law or the clock, and reached instead for the one weapon the powerful always reach for last, and what it cost Daniel Reyes to answer it, all of that is the end of the story. I will tell it, but let me sit in this silence a moment longer, the way the chamber finally learned to sit. For 61 days we had granted the sea our time, certain we were giving it a gift. We had not understood that the sea had been waiting far longer than 61 days. It had been waiting 40 years for someone to stop being in a hurry. And a single, soft, slow, grieving creature, of a people 40 years old, who lived and died in a flicker, had been the only one in the whole quick certain galaxy patient enough to wait with it. The Stratton were too old to lose loudly. That is the thing I want you to understand about what they did next, because if you have only ever known small powers, you will expect them to rage, and they did not rage. The truly old powers never rage when they are losing. Rage is what you do when you still think shouting might change the outcome. The Stratton had passed that point. They knew the facts had turned against them. They knew the chamber had heard 40 years of grief in the rock and could not now unhear it. So they did the thing the very old and the very powerful always do when the truth has stopped working for them. They stopped talking about the sea. The advocate rose on the 62nd day and did not mention Surrey at all. Instead they turned, slow and gray and gentle, to the high rings, to the human delegation, and they made an offer. And the offer was so generous and so kind and so perfectly aimed that I understood at once it was the most dangerous thing that had happened in the whole proceeding, more dangerous than the law, more dangerous than the clock. They offered humanity a seat. Not a courtesy, a real seat. The Stratton, the advocate said, had been moved, truly moved, by the young people's compassion and their diligence and their 2 years of patient work. A people of such quality should not be languishing in the cold high rings among the newest and the least. The Stratton, who had debts and favors threaded through every ring of that chamber, would sponsor humanity's elevation, a lower seat, closer to the floor where a voice carries without shouting, trade rights, survey contracts, a share even in the harvest of certain worlds, the Stratton's worlds, the 40 quarries and the ones to come. For a young people who had nothing, who had been admitted 40 years ago and given a cold seat near the machines and ignored ever since, it was everything. It was a future. It was the difference between being a people the galaxy tolerated and a people the galaxy needed. And all it would cost them was to withdraw the petition. The Stratton did not even ask them to vote against the sea. That was the craft of it, the terrible craft. They asked only for withdrawal. Let the petition lapse. Let the matter return to the certified findings. The humans would not have to say the sea was silent. They would only have to stop saying it was not. They could keep their tender feelings and their clean hands and walk away with a future for their children. And the dissolution would proceed quietly, on the schedule, while the young people sat in their warm new lower seats and did not look at the water. I watched it land on the human delegation, and I watched the delegation come apart. The senior delegate, the gray-templed one, did not answer right away, and in her not answering I saw the whole weight of what she carried, and for the first time I felt something for her that I had not felt before, which was not pity but something closer to terror on her behalf, because she was not a fool and she was not weak. She was responsible. She was the one her people had sent to secure their place in a galaxy that did not care whether they lived or died. And here was their place, offered to her, the whole future of a young poor people, real and solid and within reach, and the only price was a sea of strangers who could never thank them, who would never even know they existed, who lived too slow to ever learn the name of the people who saved them or the people who let them die. 40 years her people had reached for a seat at that table and been handed a cold chair near the air machines. And now the seat was here, in her hand. She looked at Daniel. I will remember that look. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you need them to understand that the decision is not really theirs, that they are a listener of oceans, and she is the one who answers to a whole people, that what feels like courage from where he sits feels like recklessness from where she sits, that he gets to have clean hands precisely because she is the one who has to dirty hers. She looked at him, and I think she was asking him, without words, to let her do the necessary thing, to let her take the seat, to not make her be the one who threw away her people's future for a song. And Daniel Reyes looked back at her, and what he did then was the thing I have thought about more than the recording, more than the song, more than any of it. He did not argue. He did not appeal to her conscience. He did not say a single one of the things a person says when they are trying to win. He just stood up in the high rings and he asked the presiding officer for permission to speak. And when it was granted, he did not speak to the chamber and he did not speak to the Stratton. He turned and he spoke to her, to his own delegate. In front of 2,000 years of standing, he spoke to the woman who held his people's future in her hands, and he said, "Take the seat." The chamber went still. "I mean it," he said. "If you think you should take it, take it. You're right that it's not my call. You're right that I get to be brave because you're the one who has to be responsible. I'm a guy who listens to water. You carry our whole people. If you take this, no one back home will ever blame you, and they'll be right not to because you'll have gotten them something real and I'll have gotten a sea full of strangers a few more years. So take it. I won't say a word against you. I'll go home, and I'll be glad of the warm seat like everybody else." He paused. The whole chamber leaned, the way a chamber leans when it does not yet know which way a thing will fall. "I just want you to know what we're trading, because they made it sound clean and it isn't clean." He looked then not at her but down at the floor at the great ticking clock, and out past it at nothing, at the far-off black water none of us could see. Down there, right now, somebody is singing the sound of the day they got hit. They've been singing it for 40 years because nobody ever came. And 2 years ago somebody finally came and they reached for him and they're still reaching. They held a space open 3 days ago and they're still holding it, waiting for an answer. His voice did not rise. It got quieter and the quiet was worse than any shout. If we take that seat, the answer they get is the sound of the boring charges. That's the answer. We came, they reached for us, and we sold them for a better chair. And they'll sing asterisk that asterisk for the next 40 years if they last that long, the sound of being answered and then abandoned, and there won't be anybody left in the universe who knows it happened except us. Us in our warm seats. He looked back at her. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just telling you we have to be the ones who know. Whatever you choose, we don't get to not know. And then he sat down. He had given her the seat. That was the thing. He had genuinely given it to her, taken the choice off himself and put it in her hands and promised not to blame her. And in doing so, he had made it impossible for her to take it. not through pressure, through the opposite of pressure. He had simply made sure that whatever she chose, she would choose it awake, with her eyes open, knowing exactly what she held. And no person who is fully awake to a thing like that can do it. That is the secret the Stratton, for all their 2,000 years, had never learned, because the powerful stay powerful by staying asleep to the cost of what they take. They had offered the humans a way to do the necessary thing with their eyes closed, and Daniel had simply refused to let his own people close their eyes. The senior delegate stood for a long moment. The clock ticked, tick, tick, tick. And then she turned to the presiding officer, and, in a voice that I recorded exactly and that did not shake, she declined the Stratton's generous offer, with the human delegation's gratitude, and asked that the petition proceed to a vote. I have to tell you what that did to the chamber, because the facts had not won the vote, and the proof had not won the vote. And even the grief in the rock had not won the vote. What won the vote was that 2,000 years of standing had just watched a people who had nothing turn down everything, had watched a poor young people, offered a future, refuse it to speak for someone who could never repay them, who would never even know. And every old people in those lower rings, every one of them, had gotten where they were by taking the seat, by doing the necessary thing with their eyes closed, by being the Stratton in their own time, in their own way. And now they had to vote in the open, on the record, in front of a young people who had just done the thing none of them had ever had the nerve to do. And they could not, with the humans' refusal hanging in the air like that, with their own eyes pried open by it, vote to be the people who struck the sea and walked away. It is one thing to let a voiceless thing die when you have told yourself it was always silent. It is another thing entirely to vote for its death after you have heard it sing, and after you have watched someone poorer than you refuse a fortune to save it. The first is procedure. The second is a thing you have to carry. The Stratton knew it. The advocate did not even rise for a final argument. They sat, smooth and gray and still, and the stillness this time was not strategy. It was the stillness of a very old power that has just watched a younger one do something it forgot was possible, and does not entirely understand what it is feeling, and has not felt it in a very long time. The vote was not a landslide. I want to be honest with you. Old loyalties and old debts are real, and the Stratton had threaded them through that chamber for 2,000 years, and many of the lower rings voted with them out of fear or favor or simple habit, the deep habit of the clock. But enough of the old peoples broke. Enough of them could not, with their eyes open, do it. The petition carried, not by much, by enough. Surrey C was granted a stay of dissolution. The classification of asterisk inert was struck from the catalog, and the question of standing was reopened, with the burden now reversed. The singers would be presumed to be someone until proven otherwise, instead of presumed to be no one until they could prove themselves in a language no one had bothered to learn. It is a small wording change. It is the whole world. It is the difference between prove you are alive and prove they are not. And the precedent stood. That was the thing the Stratton had truly fought, and the thing they truly lost. 40 boiled seas did not come back. The dead world stayed dead. But the chamber had now said, on its own record, in its own clock-ticking hall, that a voice could be too slow to hear and still be a voice, and that the duty to listen did not end where convenience ended. Every survey after that day was longer. Every certification of asterisk empty had to answer a new question, which was empty, or only too slow for us. The Stratton's quarries, the ones still to come, became things that had to be argued for instead of simply taken. The crack the humans had put in the wall did not close. I would like to tell you that Daniel Reyes was carried out of that chamber in triumph. He was not. That is not how it went, and I think you should know how it actually went, because the truth is better than the triumph would have been. He was not even thanked much in any way the chamber would recognize. The humans got no seat. They went back up to the cold high rings near the machines, exactly where they had started, a little poorer for having given away their survey, a little smaller in the eyes of the peoples who thought them fools for refusing the Stratton's gift. There was no reward. Daniel did not become a delegate. He was a man who listened to oceans. And when the proceeding was over, he went back to listening to oceans. Because that was the work. And the work did not change just because the chamber had, for once, been still. The last time I saw him, he was in the high rings on the day the stay was entered, packing the small device he used to listen to the live feed of the arrays. The young aide was beside him, and the senior delegate, and they were talking quietly, the ordinary tired talk of people who have been through something long and are not sure yet what it cost them. And I did a thing I have never done before or since. I left my row. A recorder does not leave the gallery. I left it and I went down to where he was, and I asked him one question, and it was not a question I had any right to ask. I asked him what his grief had been, the thing he would not name in the first year on the survey ship, the thing that had made him patient enough to hear what no one else could hear. He looked at me for a moment, this soft, slow creature of a people 40 years old who lived and died in a flicker, and he told me, "I will not give it to you. It was a small human grief, the ordinary kind, the kind that has nothing to do with worlds, and it was his, and I have kept it the way I kept the thing he said about the sea not being afraid of slow. But I will tell you what he said after, because that he said as if he wanted it carried. Used to think it was a waste," he said. "All that time I spent just sitting with it, not getting over it, not fixing it, just sitting. I thought I was broken, that everybody else moved on, and I just sat in the dark like an idiot." He almost smiled. And then I found out the only reason I could hear them was that I'd gotten good at sitting in the dark with something that wasn't going anywhere. The thing I thought was wasted is the only reason any of this happened. The slowness everybody's so scared of. It's the only reason I heard them at all. Then he finished packing his small device, and he went home with his people to their cold high seats, and I went back to my row, and the great clock ticked, the way it always had, the way it always would. Tick, tick, tick. But I have not recorded a session the same way since. I am a recorder. I am bred for steady hands and no opinion and perfect marks. And for 300 sessions I made perfect marks while worlds were certified empty and sold for parts. And I never once asked whether empty meant empty or only meant too slow for us to bother. I cannot make those marks the same way now. When a survey comes before the chamber now and the word *inert is on it, I find that my hand stops, the way it stopped on the first day, and I wait, and I listen, and I think of a sea on the far side of the catalog that sang the sound of its own wounding into the dark for 40 years, certain of nothing, hopping for nothing, just singing, just in case, just reaching, until one sad, slow, patient creature finally dropped a sound into the water and waited long enough to hear it reach back. The chamber tells itself, the humans gave the sea a voice that day. They did not. I was there. I heard it before anyone explained it to me. The sea always had a voice. It had a voice for 40 years before anyone came, and a voice the whole time the Stratton struck it, and a voice every one of the 11 days the instruments watched it and wrote down *nothing. The voice was never missing. We were. The humans did not give the sea a voice. They just slowed down, in a galaxy that worshipped speed, long enough to admit it had been speaking all along. And that is the whole of it. That is what one man did in 3 minutes he was not given, for a people he could not see, who could never thank him, in a chamber built to make sure the slow were never heard. He did not win an argument. He did not beat them with the law or the proof or even the grief in the rock. He just refused, all the way to the end, to be in a hurry. And it turned out that in 2,000 years of that great ticking clock, nobody powerful had ever once tried that. Nobody had ever just waited. The most dangerous thing in the universe, it turns out, is a small, slow creature who is not afraid of slow. I think about that every time the clock strikes. I think about it now telling you, the clock is still ticking. It is always ticking. But somewhere out past the catalog, in cold black water under enormous pressure, in no hurry at all, someone is singing and the song has changed and the new sound in it. The soft, deliberate sound that came 2 years ago and never left. The one they hold a space open for and fill and wait on and answer. That sound is not the strikes anymore. It is the sound of finally being heard. And I do not have the marks for it. I never will. Some things you do not record. You just keep them and you slow down and you pass them on.